Hello everyone, this is Ed Runkle, pastor at Tapestry Church, seen here weekly on LCTV channel 66, and you may see us live every Sunday morning at 10:30 at 22 Crady Avenue, and you're welcome here. Good morning everybody, welcome to Tapestry Church. I'm so glad you're here. We're continuing this morning in this series, God is Greater Than, and we're going to think about what it means to say that God is greater than our uncertainty. And I want to read from the New Testament book of Hebrews in chapter 11. It's often known as the faith chapter or the Hall of Faith chapter. And I'm just going to pick up at verse 8 and read through verse 12 a little bit about the faith of Abraham. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants, as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. Let me begin with this. Last fall, I was bringing our daughter Julia back home from her hip-hop classes. It was a fairly mild evening, so we had the windows down in the car. As we were driving close to our neighborhood, we noticed the odor of a skunk, and because our next-door neighbors had a litter of skunks born under their deck back in the spring, I joked with Julia, that smells like one of our skunks. Well, as we moved into our garage, we noticed that the odor of the skunk was clearly stronger. And then when we entered the house, we both literally gagged. The odor was so intense, in fact, that the gag almost gave way to a full-on hurl. Now, my wife, Bridget, who greeted us at the door, was like, I don't know what happened. I let Miley, our dog, out to do her business, and the next thing I know, there's this commotion under the kitchen window. I went out to see what was going on, and as I went out the door, Miley ran into the house and started doing somersaults all over the carpet and furniture. Do you think she could have been sprayed by a skunk? Well, let's just say the first rule when a dog gets sprayed by a skunk is keep it outside. Here's what I'm trying to get at. We never really know what's coming next, do we? I mean, so much of what is going on in the world today only seems to amplify this truth. We don't know what the next moment will bring, let alone the next month or year. Security can never be found in trying to figure it all out, or trying to divine the will of God. Yet we still want to know. We want or prefer certainty. Uncertainty is just too difficult to bear. I mean, I've told some of you this before. There was a Dutch experiment in which subjects were told they would be intensely shocked 20 times. The researchers told a second group of subjects that they would be shocked, would receive 3 strong shocks and 17 mild ones. But they wouldn't know when the intense shocks would come. And what the test showed is that the subjects in the second group sweated more, experienced faster heart rates because of the unknown factor of when those intense shocks might come. It manifested itself, that uncertainty, in a physical way. In a similar study done on colostomy patients, what the study showed was that patients who knew their colostomies would be permanent were happier 6 months after their procedures than those who were told there might be a chance of reversing the colostomy. In other words, the uncertainty led to more dissatisfaction or unhappiness. It reduced happiness. We want to know where the provision is going to come from, or if we're going to die of this disease, or how this child is going to turn out, or if our job will still, be there next month. Most of us would love if God would just kind of let us, know how things are going to turn out. But a life of faith always leans into the unknown. the unknowable. It requires that we risk vulnerability, that we trust. I mean, how did the writer of Hebrews put it? The writer of Hebrews says, before what I just read, says, faith is kind of an inner assurance, an inner assent, but is directed toward what is hoped for and not what is certain. It's kind of conviction, but in things that are not yet seen. By its very nature, it's always a step toward what cannot be fully known or understood or proved. That's why it's called faith. It's kind of interesting because some of us, for some of us, spirituality is defined otherwise. It's defined by what we know. It's defined by having certainty. I mean, you can get a sense of this if you listen to some of the language used around the church sometimes. For instance, we'll use the expression discernment to make a simple decision sound special or holy or beyond reproach. Or in some church contexts, you might hear the expression, I got a word from the Lord for you, which is usually, followed by some kind of manipulation. Or I just don't feel a peace about it, which means, I've decided not to do it. Or you might hear the expression laid on my heart, as God laid something on my heart, which usually means I want my idea to have extra authority. But to one degree or another, those expressions speak to the fact of a desire for certainty, for assurance. I mean, maybe you've been around somebody who claims to know for certain what the Bible means or what, God's direction or purpose for them is. And it's interesting how that always seems to line up exactly with what they think. But, I wonder if people who are so certain of God's direction and desire, if they ever consider the possibility that their wishful thinking and the human tendency to rationalize, maybe distorted their so-called assurance. I wonder how often they end up forcing their own will into all sorts of situations with the comfortable assurance that they're acting under God's specific direction. I personally, just don't think that I would ever be free enough of self-interest and, to reliably know that something in my heart or my head is being authorized by God and not by me. While for some, spirituality is defined by what they know, by having received specific information from God, or having, kind of their idea co-signed by the Almighty, God actually seems to be more concerned with how we handle what we cannot know, how we handle uncertainty. And that's where true faith goes into operation, where there are no clear instructions or answers, or there is no certainty. For Abraham, there was no assurance other than the promise. There were no clear directions even about where to go or how it would happen, but he went anyway. And because he went, the biblical story moves forward. By faith, he trusted God. Even more, by faith, he began to walk toward the unknown land that God had promised. I don't know, but does anybody else kind of struggle to live by faith? You want to live by sight, by what you know. That the Lord is good, sometimes that's one of the hardest things for me to believe. In my head, I know it. I believe He's good. But there are days when I struggle to live accordingly, to rest in that, to let my guard down and be still in that. I think I'm often afraid that to believe He is good is to be vulnerable, kind of like that definition of love that says love is giving someone the power to destroy you and trusting that they don't use it. Until you completely trust someone like that, you can't really know love. And until we trust God that way, that God is both good and that He is able, that's the only way we'll be free of fearing what is coming next. It's only when we trust that our God is greater than our fear of the unknown that we'll be able to rest. Even though we don't have a cue or a clue as to what might, greet us around the corner. But see, God is not content for us just to understand that He is good and that nothing is too hard for the Lord. He wants us to have the overwhelming joy of experiencing it. And so sometimes the agonizing period between His promise and His provision, kind of pushes us to the brink of what we think we believe. In other words, there are times when God arranges or orders the circumstances of our lives in such a way that from a human standpoint, His promises are impossible to fulfill. And if at that point, these promises seem unbelievable, as they did for Abraham and Sarah. And when that happens, God has exposed kind of the boundaries of our faith, and, those are boundaries He intends to expand. Let me remind you of the context of this, what I read earlier this morning. It's from the Old Testament book of Genesis chapter 12. Abram, as he was called then, is already 75 years old. God makes him a promise that he's going to be the father of a great nation that would bless the families of the earth. And, God promises to give his offspring the land of the Canaanites. However, Abram has no offspring. His wife Sarah, or Sarai as she was called then, is infertile or barren, as the biblical text puts it. Think about it. Do you ever find yourself in a situation like that? Growing fearful, not in a heart-stopping, all-encompassing fear, but kind of this constant gnawing that occurs when you look at the discouraging trends of the present and assume things will never change. Well, that's where Abram and Sarai are. Time goes by, still no child. Abram prudently plans to make his servant Eliezer of Damascus his heir. But God says, this man will not be your heir, your very own son shall be your heir. Then God takes Abram out, shows him the night sky, and tells him that his offspring will be so numerous it will be like like counting stars. But back in the tent, it's still just Abram and Sarai. More time goes by. Sarai gets desperate. Despite what her husband thinks God has told him, she can't conceive. She wants a child. She's done waiting. So she devises a solution. Her maidservant Hagar could be a surrogate child bearer for her. This sounds plausible to the 86-year-old Abram, but Abram doesn't consult God on this idea, which is, always unwise. And so their solution, their efforts to take matters into their own hands, it backfires big time. 13 more years go by before God finally tells the 99-year-old Abram that 89-year-old Sarai will bear a son. This is unbelievable news. Both respond with the equivalent of no way. But God says, yes way, and changes their names to Abraham, which means father of a multitude, and to Sarah, which means princess. A year later, Isaac is born. 25 years of waiting, no earthly reason to hope for a child. Their only hope was a promise from God. And see, that's exactly what, the way God wants His children to live, how He wants us to live, by the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not yet seen. Now, learning to live by faith and not sight, that's a hard thing. It was hard for Abraham and Sarah. It's hard for us. But God designed it that way. In fact, if you find yourself in between God's promise and God's provision, it's not because, you've messed up. It's not because God is mad at you. It's because, it's God designed it that way to it's God's process of mercifully weaning us off of, our self-sufficient delusions and letting us taste the joy of what it means to hope in Him alone. See, we learn not to trust our perceptions or emotions, but God's promises. Resting in the promises of God is kind of learned in this crucible of unbelief, in these seasons, sometimes long seasons, when everything hangs on believing that God gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that did not exist, and there is no, safety net. And so the question is, how do we do that? How are we supposed to respond? How can we live in a world of absolute uncertainty and yet be certain of our position and assured that our times are in God's hands? Well, to live this way, to live by faith, it requires that we believe that what God has told us about Himself, and that we believe that God is better than everything else. It's to trust that, He's right, that God is right, and that God knows what He's doing. I mean, think about it like this with me for a moment. I don't know about you, but I tend to feel like I shouldn't have to stand in line. I'm busy. I have important things to do. If I'm at some place and there are multiple lines, here's what I'll do. I'll get in whatever line I think is going to go the fastest. But not only will I do that, I'll also keep track of the person who would have been me in the line that I didn't get into. And if that person gets through their line and I'm still in my line, I kind of feel like my rights have been violated a little bit. I get a little testy. I know it's hard to believe, but it's true. You can ask my wife and daughter. I mean, does anybody else ever feel like that? Here's what I'm trying to get at. And this is really convicting. When we become impatient, we betray our inner assumption that we had the best thing planned. When our plans for our day or our lives are interrupted and we have to go a different way, our level of patience or impatience shows how convinced we are of our own ability to make our own plans. It shows that we've bought the lie that says we can orchestrate all the details of our lives and that we can plan them and execute all on our own. The lie then produces fear when the reality crashes in that we can't actually do it all. And then rather than being in control of all that fear, our fear takes control of us. I mean, one of the core questions that we have to answer every day is whether we truly believe that God is, knows what He's doing and that God is sovereign. That we recognize that He is ultimately the one directing our steps, and that many times those steps aren't the ones we would have taken for ourselves, but ones He has chosen, and trusting that they're better, trusting that God is not only ruling over our circumstances and the circumstances of the world, but He's also right. I mean, a person of real patience communicates, among other things, that they trust that God is orchestrating events for their good, even when those events seem haphazard or chaotic. And see, the root of all, sin in our lives, it's this discontent, it's this disillusionment with how God is handling the events in our lives. When we're disappointed with the way God is handling things in our lives. Out of that dissatisfaction and that discontent come all kinds of acts of sin. I mean, taking God at His word sometimes brings us to the strangest situations. We want to walk by faith, fully trusting God, but it doesn't always seem to make sense. So instead, we want to go our own way, and we walk by sight, by how things look to us. And then we do dumb things like Abraham and Sarah did, or, think about it in terms of fear causes us to do dumb things. Back in the fall, I think about how the fear of Ebola, how that kind of evolved. We don't have Ebola, they do, and they're living somewhere else, or look different or speak another language, but then Ebola breaks out closer to home, and our reaction is out of an abundance of fear to cancel college speakers, to close a store, to hold a school rather, to hold a cruise ship in limbo, or to consider travel bans, and on and on. when fear runs rampant and then gets amplified by, the media or a rising cycle of misinformation and panic, it causes us to do the wrong things. And I'm not talking about caution. Caution's a good thing. I'm a fairly cautious guy. But, it was fear that caused Abraham and Sarah to go with Sarah's maidservant Hagar. It was out of panic. It's why they would later get in trouble. Not once, but twice. For Abraham would try to pass Sarah off as her sister because he panicked. He took matters into his own hands. This is where remembering comes in. We remember that the circumstances we find ourselves in aren't the first time we've been in an uncertain situation. And God was faithful in past times of uncertainty. In fact, if we really think about it, we realize that even though we might be in a tough situation or have come through tough situations, God was working in unseen ways, bringing redemptive good. Christianity is really a religion of remembrance, but not just remembrance for remembrance sake, but remembering, that God is faithful. It's why the Old Testament says over and over, God has an issue with Israel's forgetfulness. It's why it's what's behind many of the feasts of the Old Testament. It's about remembering. God teaches me something. He saves me from some disaster. Days later, what? I've forgotten it. I lose sight of where He's brought me in the past as I stare into an unknown future. It might not be that I've forgotten the actual events, but I fail to remember the implications of that past event for my present and for my future. And I don't think I'm the only one. In fact, when you read the Bible, the people of God, the reason they turned away from God and trusted in themselves, relied instead on themselves and the culture around them, was their forgetfulness. So the Old Testament, there's this repeated refrain that goes, remember, I'm the God that brought you out of Egypt. When God gives his people Israel ethical commands, He always would link that with, remember, I'm the God who brought you out of Egypt. Remember what I did for you in the past. That should fuel faith for the present and for the future. Throughout the Old Testament, God commands His people to remember for the sake of faithfulness. Remember the way I brought you out of Egypt. Remember how I gave you the law. Remember your time in the wilderness. In the New Testament, Jesus continues the pattern. Take this bread and wine and remember, always remember. Some of you may be familiar with that infamous marshmallow control experiment in which children who could resist eating one marshmallow in exchange for 2 future marshmallows are likely to succeed in life. Well, it turns out that the guy running that experiment on self-control was a chain smoker. He had issues. Here's an article I read. It says even if you're a self-control guru, sometimes there are hot spots that you never quite cool. And Mischel, the guy, the psychologist who ran the experiment, his name was Walter Mischel. He never met a chocolate cake he didn't like, though flourless these days as he's been diagnosed with celiac disease. And there was his impatience that followed him through life. In research, he admitted to calling students, at 2 a.m. waiting for study results, and in lines. He can't stand waiting in one. And eating, he usually finished his meal far ahead of his dinner companions, even at the most formal of dinner parties. He's always aware that his temper is infamous among his friends and colleagues. Here's a guy whose life work is all about self-control, but in his own life there's very little self-control. There's a disconnect. Here's what I want to say. When we remember God's faithfulness, that there is no disconnect between what God says and what He's done. Therefore, we can have confidence in the future. It's like for every day for almost 16 years, my wife Bridget and I have provided our daughter Julia with food to eat. How absurd would it be for her to come down, some morning down the stairs slumped over and say, "Oh, Mom and Dad, I know you guys provided me breakfast for all these years, but I just don't think you're going to today." That we would not only look at her funny, but we would feel a bit dishonored. Like, why would she think this? God is faithful, and it's a matter of His character and His namesake. In Psalm 23 it says, "He restores my soul, He guides me in paths of righteousness for His name's sake." It's His reputation that's on the line. That's what makes God so faithful. His honor is at stake. So, regardless of the uncertainty of your present or future, you can trust that God is faithful, as He was with Abraham, as He was with Sarah. Thank you for joining us at Tapestry Church this morning. We hope you enjoyed the message. For more information, you may check out our website or Facebook page, and you may see us live weekly at 22 Crady Avenue at 10:30. All are welcome.